Good afternoon. I greatly appreciate Gresham College's invitation to give this lecture, especially thank Valerie for emailing me so many times and giving me such good directions. I also want to thank the United Kingdom Fulbright Scholar Program for awarding me a distinguished professorship at the University of Birmingham. And I apologize for the American accent and the American pronunciation, which I'm sure you noticed when I mentioned Birmingham. I also apologize for the American grammar while I'm at it. During the 2 years I lived in England, I often had schoolmates and teachers point out my inability to speak correctly. And in my defense, I did grow up in Hawaii, and I'm certain my American accent is more understandable than my Hawaiian pidgin. Now, as a disclaimer, because we always have to make a disclaimer, I have no personal connection with the American way of war. Nor does my family have any legacy of serving with the United States Armed Forces. In fact, rather the opposite. They were chased into Canada in the 1780s. My father was stationed in Great Britain during the big war with the Royal Canadian Air Force, and I had a grandfather and 2 uncles in the Great War. So as Americans would say, except as a military historian studying the United States Armed Forces, when it comes to the American way of war, I don't have a dog in this fight. Now, in recent years, the definition of the American way of war has sparked intense debate among historians, military personnel, political commentators, and public intellectuals. In the last decade, at least a dozen books with the title American Way of War or some variant have appeared, as well as dozens of journal articles, editorials, security studies, and so forth. Most of these books have been inspired by the recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Blogger Ryan Evans held a contest for the best description of the American way of war in 25 words or less, and the entries provide a snapshot of the current state of the field and reveal there's little consensus on either definition or approach. For a military historian, this discussion on the American way of war is both exhilarating and frustrating. It's exhilarating in the sense that there are a lot of historical references in the public discourse, and it's always exciting for historians when people decide that history actually matters, particularly in the United States. It's frustrating to see that so many of these works are predicated on, to be academically and snobbish about it, superficial research, sweeping generalizations, and assumption-driven analysis. At its simplest, and I think this shows, the current discussion on the American way of war can be divided into 2 camps. The first group applies the term American way of war to explain either the evolution of United States military policy or the conduct of wartime operations. It attempts to identify distinct characteristics that differentiate the American practice of war from that of other nations or cultures. The British strategist Colin Gray highlighted 12 traits of the American way of war, including apolitical, astrategic, ahistorical, culturally ignorant, technologically dependent, impatient, and so forth. Elliot Cohn, who's an American strategist, identified only 4 characteristics: a propensity towards offensive operations, a quest for quick victory and decisive battle, discomfort with ambiguous or limited political objectives, and a conviction that military and civilian responsibilities should be separated. But Cohn points out that this, and I quote here, traditional way of war is actually a caricature that stands more as a statement of ideal conditions than real circumstances, what war ought to be more than what it has actually been. Now, the second assemblage of interpreters, and the one attracting the most attention, and perhaps the ones that you came to hear about, contain both proponents and opponents of what's called the new American way of war. This group owes its origins to what its advocates believe was a technological revolution in military affairs, or RMA. And this RMA overthrew the nation's traditional methods of conducting war and replaced them with the means to wage precise, rapid, decisive, and relatively bloodless military operations. The concepts underlying this new American way of war became official US government policy in the 1990s, and this was supposedly what American forces undertook in Iraq and Afghanistan under President George W. Bush and Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. Neoconservative thinkers claimed that this new American way of war would not only ensure military dominance into the 21st century, but could be used to spread American values across the globe. Opponents of the Bush administration's global war on terror responded with their own version of the new American way of war, in which militarism, globalism, capitalism, industry, Wall Street, and various other dark forces undermined the republic and corrupted the nation. Well, tonight's audience may be familiar with the extensive literature on the British way in warfare that has engaged some of the nation's greatest historians. I believe, and I could be wrong, that Basil Liddell Hart coined the term in a 1932 book that contrasted a purported historic and successful British strategy of maritime global commerce and economic warfare with the disastrous continental commitment of 1914. As Sir Michael Howard noted, Liddell Hart's analysis was less an effort to shape, or less a history than an effort to shape foreign and military policy in the 1930s. For most American historians, the term American way of war was delineated in 1973 by Professor Russell Weigley in a book of the same name. As the title stated, let's see if this works, Weigley defined a way of war rather narrowly as the conduct of wartime military operations while claiming to write about strategy and policy. In common with several other historians, Weigley believed that the American Civil War of 1861 to 1865 marked a revolutionary break with the nation's traditional military methods. In their War of Independence, American generals had sought to wear down their opponents until the British government concluded that victory would come at too high a cost. Early 19th century US generals sought limited political goals and waged war much like their European counterparts. But in the Civil War, these traditional methods failed, and the Union shifted to a strategy of annihilation, seeking to overthrow the Confederate armed forces and destroy that state. The new strategy was manifest in the campaigns of Ulysses Simpson Grant and William T. Sherman, and continued, Weigley argued, with even more destructive results in the Second World War and in Vietnam. Unfortunately, both the catchiness of Weigley's title and the apparent simplicity of his thesis led it quickly to become what Cohn might term a caricature. Few people outside of graduate students were willing to read a 500-page book and appreciate its nuances, much less its somewhat many contradictions. Instead, they seized upon Weigley's rather vague use of the term annihilation and his argument that the Civil War marked a radical turning point in American strategy. And in the hands of analysts less sophisticated than Weigley, it's a very short step from Sherman's campaigns in Georgia to the atomic bombing of Hiroshima to search and destroy in Vietnam to the recent operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. But did the Civil War really mark the birth of that always confusing term, American exceptionalism? Was this conflict a turning point from which emerged a distinct national way of war? I should say as a disclaimer, I'm not directly challenging this book. I'm simply pointing out that many books on the American way of war link it to the Civil War. I would say, however, that this argument, in my view, is not conclusive. In fact, it can only really be sustained by ignoring a great deal of contradictory evidence. To begin with, many Civil War historians maintain that Sherman's actions in Georgia and South Carolina were what I believe the British term a one-off. That is, the most untypical of American campaigns in the most untypical of American wars. In their view, Sherman's policies were the result of strategic improvisation, dictated by very specific circumstances, not the embrace of a radically new way of war. The argument for Civil War exceptionalism becomes even more difficult to sustain if we try and establish a propensity of annihilation from the Civil War forward. The Spanish-American War in 1898, waged by the very generals who had supposedly learned annihilation strategy under Sherman and Grant, was throughout a limited war, both in its strategy and its objectives. American troops in the Philippines may have behaved brutally, but their mission was benevolent assimilation, not annihilation, and most of their actions were within the existing laws of war. President Woodrow Wilson might have fulminated that the Great War was the war to end all wars, but in practice, the American military forces in France in 1918 fought a conventional battle of attrition much like their allies did, if with much less skill. And when John Pershing suggested that the war continue until the German army publicly acknowledged defeat and Allied forces were in Germany, President Wilson stepped in. He chastised chastised Pershing for interfering in political decisions and accepted the armistice. In the 1950s, Douglas MacArthur entertained visions of annihilating communism in the Far East, but neither his political bosses nor the general who replaced him agreed. They insisted that Korea was a limited war and sought a negotiated armistice based on the status quo antebellum. And as Weigley himself admitted, Vietnam was a war of attrition, albeit with very limited and very unachievable political and military objectives. In short, the argument that the Civil War shifted American strategy from attrition to annihilation requires not only a giant leap from 1864 to 1944, but disregarding all the intervening wars and most of the wars that came after. Well, some might claim that Sherman's ghost can be seen less in national strategy or the conduct of military operations than in its intellectual legacy. The argument is that Sherman bequeathed to American military leaders a tendency to envision war as total and thus to justify attacks on the civilian population. But this argument is sort of difficult to sustain because it's based on ignoring much of the rest of the corpus of Sherman's thought. He did speak of making all Georgia howl and talked about war as hell. But in the rest of his writings, he displayed what most people would think of as a remarkably conservative view of warfare. His strategic views were governed by the military engineering curriculum that he absorbed, along with most of the other Civil War generals, at West Point at the United States Military Academy. Canadian historian Ian Hope, who's made a very recent study of American military thought, situates Sherman firmly in this scientific approach to warfare. He argues that Sherman's objective was not to terrorize the Southern population, albeit he did recognize that he was damaging morale, but preventing the main Confederate Army from using the Carolinas for supplies or as a base of operations. Nor is there strong evidence that his wartime experience changed the way that Sherman or his fellow officers regarded the conduct of war. A decade after the Civil War, Sherman's recommendations for textbooks at the United States Army's postgraduate officers' school were British, in the sense of Francis James Soddy and Edward Hamley, both of whom adopted Sherman's scientific approach to warfare. Nor is there evidence that other officers used Sherman to justify a strategy of annihilation or of attacking civilians. In fact, the U.S. Army intellectuals who wrote about war in the decades after the Civil War were mostly interested in European campaigns, the Austro-Prussian War, the Franco-Prussian War. When they did study the Civil War, they studied the Eastern Campaign and barely gave any attention to Sherman's campaigns at all. And so there's very little evidence in the 80 years between the Civil War and the Second World War that American military thought was heavily influenced by Sherman at all. If we're going to blame anybody for the revival of Sherman as a stereotype of Civil War generalship, blame the British. That is, Basil Little Hart, who in the 1930s portrayed Sherman as a master of maneuver and the indirect approach, but completely downplayed the impact of his operation on non-combatants. So just to be perverse, if Sherman's campaigns cannot be seen to mark a revolutionary turning point in the United States Army's way of war, they may have done so in the realm of maritime warfare. At the end of his march through Georgia, Sherman explained his scientific approach to a naval officer, Stephen Luce. Luce was so impressed that he decided that maritime operations needed an equal intellectual foundation. And years later, he appointed Alfred Thayer Mahan to provide one. Mahan found his inspiration in the Royal Navy's struggles against the French Navy in the Napoleonic Wars, which in turn helped prompt Julian Corbett's work, which in turn influenced Liddell Hart. So one might make a better argument that Sherman is the intellectual father of the British way in warfare than a particularly destructive American way of war. Well, if we can't prove that the Civil War marked a distinct turning point in the American way of war, perhaps other conflicts sent the United States down its distinct military trajectory. Some scholars have found this in the frontier wars and argued that the wars against the Native American populations led to a predisposition to target civilian populations. Other historians have found this in the Second World War, particularly the strategic bombing campaign. As with the Civil War thesis, these provocative interpretations are weakened by their authors' tendency towards sweeping conclusions on the entirety of the American military experience based on their own historical expertise in a specific area. Few historians have attempted Weigley's effort to identify a distinct American way of war emerging over 2 centuries of campaigns and operations. One worthy successor, Antulio Echevarria, concluded that in practice, the American way of war has been characterized by extensive political constraints. Seldom have generals been allowed to wage war as they wished. Echevarria dismissed arguments that the Civil War, or any war in fact, established a distinct pattern that was henceforth followed by American military leaders. Instead, he found that American military leaders have most consistently followed a strategy of expediency. They may have wished to annihilate the enemy quickly. I mean, what general does not? But they usually recognized that this was impossible. Echevarria also argues that contrary to the Weiglians and to the United States Armed Forces' own assertions, American military officers have seldom employed overwhelming or decisive force. The only constant in the American way of war that Echevarria was able to identify was a belief that tactical success equals strategic success, which, as he notes, places the American tradition firmly in the European way of war tradition. Another approach, very popular with the armed forces, is to define the American way of war sort of as a cyclical narrative with something of a redemption narrative tossed in. This was developed by Emory Upton in his 1881 manuscript, The Military Policy of the United States. And this continues to exert a very strong influence on the writing of American military history. In a cyclical narrative, Upton maintained that during peacetime, American citizens refused to listen to the wise and impartial counsel of their military leaders. They reduced their armed forces to skeleton organizations while boasting of their native-born martial skills. When war came, the public demanded immediate action, with the result that better trained and disciplined enemy armies quickly defeated America's citizen soldiers. Only when the nation faced disaster did it turn the conduct of war over to professional soldiers, submit to military training, undergo the necessary mobilization, and eventually win after losing far more money and blood than it should have. After victory, the nation promptly dismantled its armies extolled the accomplishments of its citizen warriors, and began the cycle again. Closely related to Upton's narrative is that of the prodigal soldiers, who, despite the disinterest of their political masters and the apathy of the American citizenry, resolutely prepare for the next war and are ultimately vindicated. This is a particularly strong narrative in the post-Vietnam War generation. A final approach is to look at the American way of war less as the practice of war than how American military officers have conceptualized or envisioned war. This would require us to define a way of war as a distillation of the intellectual inquiry of military officers, how they interpret past conflicts. But to do this, we would have to move beyond this sort of focus on individuals like Alfred Thayer Mahan or David Petraeus, and instead look at the entire corpus of military thought. That is, not just a few prominent individuals, but books, articles, war plans, general staff studies, student papers, and so forth. Seen in this context, a study of the United States Army from the 1820s on reveals that American military intellectuals have been remarkably consistent. That is, they've been consistent in subscribing to one of three viewpoints. Some view war much as an engineering project in which the correct application of strategic principles by professional elites will result in a predictable outcome. This was the viewpoint that William T. Sherman learned at the U.S. Military Academy and can be seen in the 1990s Powell Doctrine. Some view war as a sort of heroic struggle between nations and cultures in which martial virtues such as patriotism and discipline and leadership and morale and so forth will eventually triumph. And then a third group view war as essentially a management problem in which the military works with the political leadership to coordinate political, military, economic, social, and other resources to achieve the desired outcome. All three of these groups may exist at the same time, and in fact, what some people see as a unitary U.S. Army voice is in fact usually a very discordant group of people debating one of these three. Well, in the late 1980s, the term American way of war suddenly took on a new meaning, one that went far beyond the sort of historical debate. It began to be employed by a diverse group that included military officers, civilians in the international relations community, security studies experts, journalists, public intellectuals, and so forth. Much of this view, or much of this excitement, was fueled by a belief that emerging technologies, such as precision-guided munitions, computers, stealth aircraft, satellite communications, provided a revolution in military affairs, or RMA. Used effectively, such technology could not only offset, which was a very popular term at the time, offset the Soviet superiority in manpower and materiel in Europe, but also ensure that such a conflict did not escalate into a thermonuclear holocaust. Initially, much of the enthusiasm for the RMA came from critics of American defense policy. These reformers claimed the United States was investing in upgrading traditional weapon systems, tanks, artillery, fighter planes, and so forth, in order to wage a conventional slugging war of attrition. What was needed, they argued, were technologies that enabled smaller, lighter, more agile forces to defeat the Soviet masses. And these reformers dismissed the old or traditional American way of war, I'll just use a few of their words, methodical, attritional, bloated, bureaucratic, over-centralized, cumbersome, and conservative. They asserted that a study of the past showed that the nation's political and military leaders had relied on unimaginative, brute force tactics and overwhelming resources to grind down and destroy their opponents. Against this, they contrasted the possibility of a rapid, decisive, and cheap new American way of war. They claimed that technology could remove the fog of war that Clausewitz had identified as an inherent to armed conflict. And it would allow commanders to instantly communicate, and unerringly target, and to destroy the enemy with absolutely minimum casualties and minimum effort. Both conservatives and traditionalists found vindication in the Persian War of 1991. To the American armed forces, it justified their procurement programs that they had done since Vietnam. To the reformers, it proved that new technology provided an insurmountable advantage. Now, the US Air Force took the lead by claiming credit not only for most of the success in the Gulf War, but also for creating a radically new way of war, what came to be known as effects-based operations. Now, effects-based operations postulated that information superiority provided precise targeting of critical centers of gravity at all levels, the operational, the strategic, and the tactical. And the destruction of these centers of gravity would trigger immediate military collapse. Information superiority would also deny the enemy government the ability to control its citizens. A few well-placed bombs would knock out the opposition's communications and isolate or even kill the leadership. Without any directing brain, armed resistance would be sporadic, uncoordinated, and too slow to respond to American attacks. Now, this slide is perhaps more revealing than the United States Air Force publicists intended. It illustrates, as you can see, a sterile, surgical, managerial version of conflict. The Air Force intends to wage war by a sort of mathematical formula that will allow it to calibrate with scientific precision just how 16 bombs dropped in 2004 can achieve the cumulative strategic impact of 9,000 bombs dropped in 1944. I mean, what is the formula that provided these equations? More insidiously, I would argue, this slide implies a contract with the American political leadership and the American public that the Air Force can fight and win wars with minimal time, expense, and trouble. The Navy was also developing its own concept, what it termed network-centric warfare. Like the Air Force, Navy theorists were fascinated by the possibilities of the information age and by a vision of forces dispersed across the globe, concentrating their military power to quickly overwhelm opposition. Its proponents argued that the new technology provided a transparent battlefield in which information could flow instantly between the commander and the tactical units, in which the enemy's positions and movements would be instantly targeted and destroyed. Now, although the Air Force and the Navy disagreed on which service should actually conduct operations, they all agreed in the same scientific vision of warfare in which super-empowered Americans destroyed a virtually powerless enemy. Now, from the beginning, the attraction of the new American way of war was in part ideological. Military reformers claimed the United States was in danger. If it failed to grasp the opportunities offered by the information age, its enemies would not. They warned that history revealed numerous examples of great nations brought to ruin by more adaptive opponents. Thus, as Thomas Barnett's declaration, written at the height of the Bush era's military adventurism, makes clear, its proponents also began to define the new American way of war in rather nakedly ideological terms as a means to execute the United States' global hegemony. Well, in 1996, much of the reformers' agenda was codified in the United States Department of Defense's Vision 2010. And these slides, by the way, are taken from the Vision 2010 pamphlet. As this slide shows, information superiority would allow, and technological innovation, so the sort of driving wheels, okay, will then allow for these four things to occur, which will then create massed effects, which will then destroy an enemy who is obligingly parked in the middle of the desert. And again, you know, this is also taken from vision. This slide shows information support engaging in dominant maneuver from a headquarters back in the United States or some safe place. Information is instantly collected evaluated, and then disseminated to all these units, which are then moving at such a high rate of tempo that the enemy is paralyzed. This leads to, you can't make these terms up if you try, asymmetric leverage. And once again, notice the influence of the Gulf War. The enemy is once again parked in the desert, allowing Americans to conveniently surround them. There's no civilians, there's no hospitals, there's no schools, there's no nuisances to hinder the full application of American firepower. And so as its simplest, this is a very war as a managerial process in which the primary problem is the identification and destruction of targets. I'm not going to get on too much on this, but what's interesting about this is military effects are defined only in the most immediate tactical terms. They don't discuss, for example, the effects of destroying the military forces and government of a one-party dictatorship or a tribal confederacy. In other words, the very failed state that the United States' national security policy said were the most likely places for U.S. military intervention. And they also don't see the consequences of if this brilliant, fast way of war fails to achieve quick victory, you've got American forces that are only equipped and trained for it. And so the result is likely to be a large and a long and unnecessarily bloody war of attrition. Now, Vision 2010 then became the basis for service transformation plans. For the Army, or for the Air Force and the Navy, this was largely seen as confirming their existing procurement policies. But for the United States Army, Vision 2010 was seen as an opportunity to scrap the Cold War arsenal and create an entirely new armory with all the firepower and of mechanized forces and all the mobility of light forces. And this led to the Future Combat System. And some people, of course, immediately called this, Star Wars, the Stormtrooper model. Now, you're not going to believe this next slide, but I want to show you this. This was the transformation plan, unveiled in extensive, even excruciating. This, as you can see, this is. All right, here we go. And it's not over yet. Ta-da! This illustrates sort of 2 points that's worth noting about the new American way of war. First of all, marketing is in many ways much more important than strategy. And second of all, there's this one-size-fits-all vision of the future battlefield. There's nothing in here that might call for the United States Army to be deployed in a counterinsurgency or nation-building or humanitarian interventions, which, interestingly enough, was what the national security policy claimed it was going to be committed to. Now, that's a scary picture. Donald Rumsfeld, who became Secretary of Defense in 2001, embraced the new American way of war with a fervor that even some of its supporters found rather terrifying. In what was described as a hostile takeover, he waged an all-out offensive against military leaders he viewed as too set in the patterns of the Cold War. His 2002 article in Foreign Affairs, written shortly after the initial days of the Afghanistan invasion, hailed this operation as a revolution in military affairs that proved the transformation program was necessary and working. He also identified the lessons of the Afghanistan war as showing the need for many of the things that appeared in effects-based operations and network-centric warfare, among them seamless communications, but also accepting Allied assistance, defending the United States by preventative attack, and perhaps most important, telling the truth to the American people. Well, the promise and the flaws of the new American way of war quickly became apparent during the succeeding campaigns of the global war on terror. I always liked how the British pronounced it, like, gee, what? But in the initial flush of rapid victories in both Afghanistan and Iraq, culminating in the capture of the capital cities, the destruction of the conventional military forces, commentators, particularly on the right wing, proclaimed the dawning of a new age of national greatness, implemented and enforced by the new American way of war. In a 2003 article on the 100 rules for the new American way of war, this included the right of preventative warfare, the preservation of the global economic system, and a virtual blank check for the American military to intervene pretty well anywhere that a threat might be perceived. Max Boot's article, The New American Way of War, praised Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld for dragging the United States Army into the 21st century and declared that the conquest of Iraq, and I'm quoting here, must rank as one of the most signal achievements in military history, comparing favorably to the previous gold standard, Germany's 1940 Blitzkrieg. When these occupations turned into civil wars and insurgencies, some of these same authors quickly shifted into the camp of General David Petraeus, whom they praised as an anti-Rumsfeld insurgent, whose counterinsurgency strategy was the real American way of war. Now, this triumphalist chest beating pretty well collapsed pretty quickly, but as they say, some acolytes quickly moved into rather harsh critics. But for the most part, their complaints are largely that the Bush administration failed to properly execute the new American way of war, and that the beneficiaries of American intervention, the Iraqis and the Afghans, didn't appreciate it. Perhaps the most interesting critique has come from conservative commentator Andrew Bacevich, who, as his quote makes clear, identifies a fundamental disconnect between the political and military leaders that created a sort of strategic vacuum in which tactical excellence and imperialist ideology dictates where and when America will intervene. And now I'm about to get in real trouble. In contrast, most of the left critique has been derivative in both its tone and its assumptions, even to having Vietnam-era public intellectuals like Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky reviving their old criticism of the dangers of American capitalism and imperialism and so forth. Many of these writers fail to display a sort of fundamental grasp of military realities, national strategy, or the armed forces. I mean, their message is essentially to the already converted, not to the informed reader. And at worst, it can consist of little more than incoherent ranting. The index entry for one of these books, highly praised, Tom Englehart's The American Way of War. If you go to the index entry for The American Way of War, you'll see the following entries: conceptually unending, victim discourse, and as a Hollywood movie. But Engelhart never explains in the entire book what he means by the American way of war. Now, what is the state of the debate at present? I think there's actually grounds for optimism. The recent Army operational concept rejects much of the scientific way of war that appeared in Vision 2010 and the Army's Transformation Initiative. It grapples with the problem of achieving military success in what it calls a complex world. In very sharp contrast to the RMA literature, it no longer finds the solution in technology. It recognizes that military and political goals can seldom be achieved simply by precise targeting. And perhaps most importantly, in the current term in the American military, it recognizes that the enemy gets a vote in the nature of the conflict. I'm also rather pleased that as the debate has diminished in ideological fervor, it's benefited in breadth and scholarship. And it takes academics about 7 years to comment on what now is a burning issue. So I anticipate that as the years go by, there will be more and more that's better and better. Many of the things I've read recently have been well-researched, thoughtful, balanced, And I think they're going to make even more substantial contributions. And so what directions would I urge people to take? So I'm going to end my remarks with some suggestions. Obviously, this is speaking from my own self-interest, I would like to see scholars take a more international and comparative perspective. The American way of war debate has been extremely insular. It's been Americans studying Americans. As I've suggested, this argument for American exceptionalism is really based a lot on cherry-picking specific examples and ignoring a great deal of contradictory evidence. I'm encouraged by the recent trends to no longer define the American way of war solely as the conduct of wartime operations. I'd like to see people expand into areas, and one of the things I've become very interested in how war is marketed to the American public. You know, looking at Hollywood, looking at the government, looking at the process by which warfare and the military is marketed. The selling of war, it's a fascinating topic, and it's often been left to cultural historians who really don't understand and don't know where to look for the military's role in shaping that narrative. To ask one question, how can today's stereotypes of the American military forces be reconciled with the nation's insistence in 1958 that Elvis Presley be drafted, and Elvis Presley in 1960 making a movie about his military experiences, GI Blues, which if you see is a fascinating view of how Americans looked at their military before Vietnam. Lastly, and this is what I'm here to do, I would really like to see more comparisons between the British and the American armed forces. They fought together as allies in 4 20th century wars. They both conducted counterinsurgency operations throughout the world. As I've indicated, there's a great deal of intellectual overlap between the British and the Americans that I think has often been ignored. And it also would be very interesting to study how the British and the Americans look at each other, both in war and peace. These are fruitful areas for future study. I look forward to hearing your comments and your suggestions. Thank you very much.